2025 draft is officially in the books. And today, I wanted to dive into the Lions draft approach for the 2025 season. And of course, after the draft, the really only conversation is, man, were the Lions aggressive enough to get an edge rusher? And that's the video that pops because it was an edge rusher. And it's such a fascination with a lot of people in the Lions addressing that position based on last season. But it got me to thinking a little bit, seeing the Brad Holmes pressers afterwards and understanding his frustration of how he says, man, I'm going to take best player available. We're going to take the guys that we like. And, we're all on board with, hey, that doesn't have to be a specific position. But then if it's not that position, we all step back and we're like, wait a minute, maybe you should have drafted an edge higher. Why didn't you draft the edge higher? And today, the more I thought about how the Lions actually approached this draft, the more I came to the conclusion that, man, this draft was maybe even better than I initially thought. So let's get right into it. Now, explaining what I mean based on that last statement that I just made is I think the Lions' approach to the draft actually makes a ton more sense based on what I personally wanted to see entering this offseason. And today I wanted to really dive into why that is the case. Yesterday it hit me that we had all these needs videos before the draft, and I wanted to go back as everybody's talking about needs and addressing needs and what do you still need to fill and UDFAs. I wanted to go back and see what I thought the Lions' needs were before the draft and then line that up with how I thought they actually approached the draft. And when I went back and watched those videos, it hit me that what the Lions did, specifically with their first pick in this year's draft, was exactly what I thought the biggest need was for this team during the offseason. But it obviously goes deeper than that because it wasn't just the draft. It was also the way they approached free agency as well. And at least from my perspective, what I believe the biggest issue was and what I had been pushing for the Lions to get better at, which was specifically their ability to stop the run and how I felt this past season, it took a major step back at stopping the run. Obviously, a lot of that had to do with depth. We had injuries, but we have those coming into this year, right? Aleem's not going to be ready for the beginning of the season. We don't expect Wingo to be ready for the beginning of the season. So these are problems that aren't only in the past, but they're also in the future. We understand that these are going to be an issue as we start into next season. But then when you start to tie in free agency, and while the Lions didn't make a lot of splash moves, who they added in a guy like Roy Lopez, and then the way that they attacked this year's draft, I can't help but sit back and feel like, okay, we got answers on what the Lions felt like they needed to go after and the players that they liked clearly. But not only that, because I like the value, especially on day 3, I love the value of their draft picks. I think where they ended up getting their players versus where I had those guys ranked was fantastic. I think they addressed what honestly was their biggest issue, at least in my opinion. To me, it was never simply just about the Lions rushing the passer. Can they get after the quarterback? And it was always to me about first, the Lions have to get back to being that team that, as Todd Walsh once said, would earn the right to rush the passer. To go in this draft and is like, hey, man, we really like this nose tackle because this also helps you not chase the need. Nose tackle, so play as your defensive tackle that could also play maybe as an under tackle, a guy that can line up outside shade of a guard that has a little bit more range to his game. That would be best because that's a little bit different for me. The run defensive aspect, the flexibility we need to have. We're dealing with a lot of guys coming off injuries. So I got a couple graphics that I want to go through here based on last year and kind of based on what the Lions did this offseason. We'll fly through this, but I want to make this point and kind of give my take on the Lions draft approach as a whole. So first graphic we have here, and you can see at the top, it starts right with that, earn the right to rush the passer. The Lions had to get better against the run. Now, like I said, a lot of this, yes, injuries did play a big part in this, right? Early in the season, it was the linebacker position, losing Alex Anzalone hurt. When we got him back, he was helpful for us for sure. We were rotating through linebackers, and throughout all that time, Jack Campbell was the guy holding it down. He was fantastic, put a lot of stress on him, had to deal with blockers at the second level a lot, but he was making a ton of plays against the run. He was fantastic, took massive strides this past year. Then when Alex came back, he helped us. Now, that didn't mean it was always perfect, right? We still had some issues in there, but it helped a lot versus where we were when we were kind of just rotating guys into linebackers. And of course, losing Derek Barnes and trying to figure out who could replace Derek Barnes as that sandbacker within this defense, that was a little bit of a struggle as well. I think Trevor Nowatzki, by the end of the season, you felt pretty comfy with him in that role when he was also available because that position was still banged up as well. They tried some different options at that spot. They actually went through a ton of different options at that spot. So injuries did play a role. But as mentioned, those are going to play a role at least early in next season. And of course, going into the future based on contracts and age of our defensive line and of our trenches. And as you can see at the stop, just to get things started, Lions run defense this past year took a step back. Simply put, it just took a step back this last year. 20th in expected points added as a run defense. Now, of course, that is not just looking at the yards per game, which was 5th in football, but a lot of that is the Lions put up a ton of points. And even going back a couple years ago, I'll make the point now and I'll showcase that even going back a couple years ago when the Lions run defense took their steps forward, the games where they weren't great against the run, but teams didn't run for a lot of yards were because the Lions scored a ton of points and the opponent couldn't continue to be in a spot where, hey, we can keep running the ball, or they would turn the ball over because we got ball hawks in the back end. You think about San Francisco this past year, the interceptions Kirby Joseph had flipped that game, right? It put us in control of that game just like that. And that was the difference. So there's other elements that can kind of take a team out of the game rather than just scoring points. But typically, putting up points pulls teams out of that situation where they can do that. But the Lions took a step back, 4.5 yards per carry, 20th, and expected points added run defense. That was from 14th the year before. So it was a step back there. And then in 2022, you look at the run defense lines were horrible against the run by the numbers. But if you remember, we won 9 games in 2022. So if you just look at that number and you're like, well, we won 9 games, so it couldn't have been just that. If you look at when the Lions started winning football games, a major consistent difference, because it even shows up in a few losses down the stretch, where the Lions stopped the run. And we're going to see some examples here. Once that winning started, the Lions started to stop the run. It started with Green Bay, 11 carries for 34 yards to their starting back. Their backup had 9 carries for 25 yards with a win where you held them to 9 points. Then he went to Chicago, and again, Chicago, they just didn't run the ball as often in that game, 10 of 57 and 9 of 37. It's not terrible against the run, but you also scored 31 points. You kind of just outscored them. Fields obviously just took off in that one. The Giants that season, he held Saquon to 15 carries for 22 yards. He beat them 31-18. So you're still putting up points, but ultimately you took away that option, that element, which is such a big element of their game at the time. And then you look at teams like Buffalo, who ended up beating us on Thanksgiving. They had 164 yards rushing in that game. There were some different factors. We still could have won that game at the end, and we scored a lot of points, but they ended up beating us, had 164 yards. You get back to winning, you play Jacksonville, and you ended up holding them to 13 carries for 54 yards to their top back, but you also scored 40 points in that game. So again, that's another example of, hey, yeah, maybe they didn't run the ball incredibly well, but there wasn't terrible efficiency there. They just couldn't run the ball because they were down so much in that game. You go to Minnesota, you held Devlin Cook 23 yards on 15 carries. So again, a team that kind of leaned on that, you took that away from them. You play the Jets, Zonovan Knight, who was a Lion, 13 carries, 23 yards. It was a low-scoring game, but you stopped the run. And then you took your other loss, which was the one that was the huge hiccup down the stretch, really kept us out of the playoffs, I believe. And that's when Carolina ran for over 300 yards against us. And it was a huge talking point. 2 backs had over 100 yards rushing. One had over 160, another had over 120. And that was the hiccup loss that you had where a team just gashed us on the ground. Sam Darnold cooked against us on the ground. And when we got back to winning again, it was teams weren't running the ball all over us. They weren't growing for 100-plus yards. Remember, there was a stretch there was like teams aren't running for 100-plus yards. Chicago's top runner, 5 for 31, 6 for 24. Again, Fields took off, but you scored 40 points in that game. And then Green Bay at the end of the season, 12 carries for 48 yards. A.J. Dillon, 9 carries for 33 yards. So you got that in check. As bad as you were on the season, you got it in check. You held it down for the most part, or you outscored teams, which was the difference in the second half of that season. And then if you take a smaller sample size this past year, of course, I always point out that Washington game as the game where the Detroit Lions got cooked on the ground. And it was the same thing that knocked really everybody out of the playoffs in the NFC is the inability to stop the run. We saw it happen to Washington against Philly. We saw it happen to the Rams against Philly. We saw it happen to us against Washington. The inability to get off the field and stop the run led to efficiency offensively. And we know that really well as Lions fans, and how well we run the football and how it makes everything else be magical and everything else works when you have that element within your offense. And in the playoffs, teams that couldn't stop that, they got beat in the playoffs. And the Lions were a great example. You go back to this past season, right, and you look down the stretch for the Lions where you had a couple losses. You lost to the Buffalo Bills. Cook went 14 for 105 yards in that game. You also gave up some explosives, but you didn't stop the run. There was a ton of efficiency there. Swift, you held Swift in check. You held Isaac Guerendo in check. But again, both of these games, they're not running the football because you're scoring so many points they couldn't run the ball. And then you get to Aaron Jones and David and Cam Akers. They scored 9 points. Defense was awesome situationally in this one. But again, that's just not a ton of carries for some of the efficiency that we saw. And then we get to the playoffs and Washington runs all over us, right? We actually did well against Jaden Daniels. It wasn't a quarterback that torched us in this game. It was actually Brian Robinson, 15 of 77. Austin Eckler, 6 of 47. The efficiency is crazy there on 21 carries. And on top of that, they were a great rushing team coming in. They were super versatile. You know, I was questionable with the Lions game plan just in general in that game. I've talked about that before. We got to get better to being the team that shuts down your run. It's not just that we're outscoring you so you can't run, because Washington, if we don't fumble, we go 14-3, say, then that element kind of goes away from them a little bit. And even Dan Campbell spoke on after the game how, man, that fumble was huge because we could have gone up 2 scores. Well, yeah, that you can still win games with that recipe. It just leaves a smaller margin for error. And it allowed teams to kind of stay in the game because once that happened, they go down and score. The run game is really not in place for them because they really played with control that entire game. So for the Lions, my whole thing was we got to get back to being the team that stops the run. And it's not that like, hey, man, if we weren't all the way healthy, we wouldn't have been better against the run, because we absolutely would have been. but we do need to address this offseason, right? All the talk about edge and it's about depth because of health. Well, why aren't we talking about the interior defensive line because of health? Because Davenport's going to be ready to begin the season. It's the interior that's not going to be ready to start the season. So it's almost weird that that gets more of the conversation than the flip side, which is actually, yeah, we should get guys that can actually help play the run, right? That's a key. To give you an outline, we got dudes that can get after it. We know it's about health, but we obviously have guys that can get after the quarterback. Lee McNeil is great, right? And these are their true pass set grades, which means that it's not a play action, it's not a rollout, right? It's a true pass set. These are the grades of our defensive linemen this past season, right? Lee McNeil was obviously fantastic there, 80.5 according to PFF's 30 pressures. Miles Adams came in. He was a good pass rusher, not a great run defender, but he fits a little bit stylistically. He's a very good pass rusher. That was always his background. Levi got after it this past season, right? He had some big games down the stretch. He was doing that from the inside and the outside. Aiden Hutchinson, of course, was the best in football last year, and you could see that even if you look at some of the other advanced analytics as well, which we have. Marcus Davenport was really good for a few games, even though we only saw him in a few games as a rusher. He can do both. Josh Paschal, a little bit on the lower side, right? That's a little bit more where you're like, okay, run defender first, make some effort plays potentially as a pass rusher. Hopefully he develops there more. But the other element of that too is allowing Josh Paschal to get to the interior because that's where he's going to have his biggest impact. Which is just another argument for making sure you improve the interior of the defensive line to stop the run. Just stopping the run in general as a whole, however you wanted to address that, because if you're not getting teams in obvious passing situations, Josh Paschal can't kick inside because now he's much worse against a run, which leads to a lot less consistency and efficiency as a player. Because he's kind of a bowling ball that doesn't have a lot of variety of ways to win on the edge. But that was always the case when we drafted him. We always knew that's who Josh Paschal was. And now you throw in Tyleik Williams to that mix. And here's the word that I'm going to use is guys that can do one or the other or both, meaning guys that I feel like can impact both the run game and the pass game in a positive way for the Lions. And I think just by going through this roster of what these guys have already proven in the NFL and also kind of projection for some of these guys, you're going to see the amount of guys that I feel like can do both. And we'll have that highlighted here at the bottom. So you go to now Tyleik Williams, who I believe will be able to do both, even though it's a full projection because of his skill set. I don't think he's going to be an elite rusher early, but he could be a plus rusher early as you're kind of working through that. They worked outside guard, but he's going to stop the run early. He's going to be good there, right? He's going to have to speed up, I think, a little bit for nose tackle, but I expect that in time he can be a guy that fits into, yeah, he's going to impact positively in both categories. That's Lions vision, hopefully there. You have Ahmed now to that mix, which I won't label him yet, because for me, we'll talk about why he makes sense in terms of the play strength. And then you have Roy Lopez, who also got after it when he had his opportunities this past year, which is perfect because, again, when we talk about the depth of the interior defensive line, he was 27th in terms of grade here in true pass sets. Only 7 pressures, limited sample size, but he also got after it when he had the opportunity. So now let's expand on this a little bit more. And I'm going to skip down to the bottom here, and then we'll come back a little bit because when you look at this defensive line, as you can see, I kind of rolled through and listed these guys here. And the green showcasing players that I think are going to have a positive impact in both categories. DJ Reader can. Now, he needs to be more effective, I think, as a pass rusher next year, but he can give you a plus energy. And I think towards the end of the year, we saw that as a rusher, but he's definitely going to help you against the run. We saw that this past year when he was on the field. Roy Lopez has proven that he can give both. Maybe not at an incredibly high level, but he can do both, which is massive when you look at what the Lions needed. Because if you look at the bottom here, the key that I noted is last year, the interior depth for the Lions was this. It was Miles Adams and Pat O'Connor, two guys that we like. Pat O'Connor played everywhere, but when he was inside a guard, you had issues because he could not hold against double teams at all. That was not his game. He was going to try to split gaps and get upfield. So that's okay because he'd bring some pass rush productivity when he worked over the center. Problem is he wasn't going to be stopping the run very much from that spot. So you probably want him a little bit wider, but of course that limits then the pass rush production that you're actually getting when you push him a little bit wider. So he was definitely a depth piece, but he's one of those guys that I would say, okay, he brings more as a rusher than he did as a run defender. So that's where Pat O'Connor kind of falls in. Same thing with Miles Adams, I would say falls in that category. Hopefully he brings more as a run defender. He hasn't played a ton, but he definitely brought some juice as a rusher. The flip side is you have your backups last year that were able to impact the run game in a positive fashion. Maybe they weren't elite here, but they could. At least that was the outlook for them. But in terms of pass rush, you really didn't get much. And I remember last season doing this and putting this video together, how often I talked about, man, the one concern on this defensive line isn't just the edge rusher because Za'Darius was getting the job done. We had dudes that were flashing. Levi was great down the stretch. Those guys came into their own and gave us that juice. The problem was we didn't have guys that could play run and pass on the inside. We didn't have guys that were going to go from playing the run to transitioning to getting after the quarterback. Without Aleem, we just didn't have that piece anymore. And it was like, can DJ Reader get there? And DJ Reader would give you a little bit, but you really didn't have much on the inside there, especially beyond DJ Reader. And with that, Chris Smith, Broderick Martin, now the Lions have addressed that. this year. And it not only helps for this year because it also helps going forward when you think about what this could look like going forward for the Lions, but especially for this season. So now, as you look at that list of players, I believe that the Lions have about 7 guys I could confidently say are going to impact both of those categories, run and pass, in a positive fashion now. DJ Reader, Roy Lopez, Lee McNeil, Tyleek Williams, Levi Onwuzurike. We've seen it from all of those guys except for Tyleek, Marcus Davenport, and Aiden Hutchinson. All of those guys will impact in a positive way for both. They will set the edge, they will collapse the pocket, and they'll rush the passer. They can all do that. You have 7 guys now that can do that. Not that I'm making the case like Lions shouldn't have went after another pass rusher, or I wouldn't have been happy with a DPR the Lions could have added, because I would have. But we also clearly saw what the Lions want out of that edge, and they've stuck kind of true to form, which is guys that are going to, as Brad Holmes said on the first graphic, set the edge first and foremost. They have to set the edge and then win the rush. That's what he's after. And clearly with Ahmed, that's exactly what they were going after there. A DPR wouldn't really fit into that category. I would still like to have that, but I think you have 7 guys on the defensive line that fit into that category, with some unknowns of Makai Wingo and Ahmed, and with some guys that kind of bring a little bit of both. Al-Quadin Muhammad, probably a little bit more as a rusher, as we saw this past year. Actually, if you look at the productivity, he was 15th in the NFL in terms of pass rush productivity in the NFL. 15th. Okay, not the biggest sample size, but it's pretty strong there. Trevor Nowaski, Derek Barnes, even though we didn't have Barnes either this past year, 15th. And then that brings you to another conversation, which is where you can question, okay, well, if we are going to add a DPR, which you can consider Muhammad if you want, though he got better against the run. So credit to him, he earned coming back this past year. He earned that, right? As kind of our number 2 opposite of Za'Darius. That dude got after it a little bit. He showed a plus rush ability, and he got better against the run, even though that's not really his build. But then you could also question to yourself, well, okay, after 102, because Lions did have to trade up to go get the receiver Tesla, if they would have just sat at 102 and took an edge, now they could have moved up, right? I like Josiah Stewart. He wasn't great against the run, but he could really get after the passer, in my opinion. You're kind of getting a little bit of that at this point in the draft, where you're kind of getting maybe one or the other, or it's a development, which is kind of Ahmed in terms of being a pass rusher, but also as a run defender as well. But at 102 and beyond, how many of these guys would you have made the case that you would have said, hey, they're going to bring more pass rush productivity, and let's just say year 1, because we know what Muhammad is, than Muhammad? Is David Walker going to bring that? I think David Walker would have had a chance. I don't think it would have been by much, but I think he could have. Jack Sawyer, I'm not very confident. I think he would have definitely brought more as a run defender. I was a huge Jack Sawyer guy. As a rusher, I wouldn't have been super confident they were getting much more there, right? We saw games in college where he was just kind of silent, and that's college. Baron Sorrell, no. Actually, I put him in red here because I had Baron Sorrell ranked below Ahmed, my edge kind of big board. Kyle Kennard, I do believe Kyle Kennard could have brought more rush. Kennard's play strength, that's a very large concern, right? And for Muhammad, even though he's kind of fits that category with build, he definitely played the run pretty well towards the end of the year. Kennard, that's a legit concern immediately. Q Robinson, I could have seen the case for Q, but we really haven't seen much there. He's only played like 200 snaps. The guy hasn't played much at all in terms of football and edge, and he doesn't really have much variety. He's just super twitchy on the edge. I like taking a swing on him. Yeah, I had him ranked Ahmed, and Braden Swinson would have been the one guy that I would have try to make a strong case that he could have been a better rusher and a run defender than Muhammad year 1. I would have made that case. Again, some limitations, but I would have made that case. Elijah Roberts, I had ranked below Ahmed, and then Barron, I had ranked below Ahmed. So there is that question of like, okay, how many of these guys do we actually trust over Al at this spot? Because now I've already, I believe, made the case that interior defense line, at least for me, was the bigger need rather than edge rusher at 28. So you do that. Then once you get beyond that pick, right, now all of a sudden you take your guard, which again was to me a bigger need than edge or a designated pass rusher. You had to get better there, which they addressed. So now you get to that point where you're like, okay, next pick would have been 102, or you would have had to trade up. What makes sense at this point, right? Which guy would have been better? Now, you could have said they could have moved up for somebody, and that would have been the case at that point, but now you're in to that third pick for you. Think about it like this, and I'll use 2 games examples. I've used them before, so it's easy for me to draw back on these, but the 2 losses Lions had, of course, Buffalo. Buffalo is more than just a loss. Buffalo 1 was a blueprint of how teams are going to attack us when we were at the state we were as a defense, and that was a lot of pulling outside the tackle, and it was sealing down our interior defensive linemen, putting a lot of stress on our linebackers by spreading the box, putting a lot of receivers on the field, spreading us out, putting stress on that front 6 a lot of times to be able to stop the run. Your DB run support kind of wasn't involved, which, as we know, when the run defense got really good in 2022, when it took that big jump, it was because DB run support took the big jump, right? We think of the Dallas game. That's when it came, when Okudah went crazy. That's when the run defense came together, is when it worked as a whole. But when Buffalo started to kind of take that element out of it, and they said, okay, your front 6 has got to beat our offensive line and the ball carrier in Josh Allen, we started to struggle to stop the run. And that was the first team that put us in that spot. And what it led to is our defensive linemen were getting sealed on the interior, and then they would pull outside and work on our edge rushers, which were attacked at the point of attack. And we didn't have consistency in terms of setting the edge, settling into a gap and pressing back inside. We didn't have consistency there. We could set the D gap, but will we always make a play? Not always. We might get pushed backwards, but we definitely weren't getting consistency in setting the D gap and pressing into the C gap to give it a smaller window for the linebackers to play through, which stressed the heck out of our backers. And as I said last year, was the answer then to this question, hey, go replace Alex Anzalone? No, that wasn't the answer to the question. Was the answer to replace Jack Campbell? Absolutely not. He was one of the best backers in football, right? And Derek Barnes should be back. So the answer for the Lions wasn't going to be go that route. Malcolm Rodriguez is also good against the run. Hopefully he gets back and healthy. That'll help. Throw Grant Stewart into the mix. The answer for the Lions was the front. It was always the front to me. So to me, when I look back and I kind of put all these things together, it just makes sense. So what does the Lions additions do? Well, for one, Ty League brings some versatility, which Vita Vea also used in Tampa, which is where our defense finds coach, to play outside the guard, right? So he could play into a 3 technique, and that's what he did majority of the time at Ohio State anyway. You know, people look at him and knows he did that there. I'm sure he'll come in and do that right away for us alongside DJ Reader because he'll be comfy there. It'll be his natural spot, and we'll need it with Aleem out. So you have that flexibility, which is good, though, because not just for now, it's also for the future. And for the Lions in the future, if DJ Reader is gone this year, which is a very real possibility, a guy that can kick outside, because even though he's our nose in that defensive line scheme based on the fronts that Tampa Bay would play, their nose at times would be outside the guard. They'd work outside the guard with Vita Vea. He was a big guy, but that was an advantage they would look to create. Then they put their speed guy or their rusher over the 1 tech, or they put him in a 2I, and then they get more juice to the interior. So the flexibility is necessary, and both Aleem and Tyleek will bring that. It allows for a lot more creative fronts, which Tampa Bay utilized. And if you watch Tampa Bay against Washington versus us, they shut down Washington's run. We didn't have a great answer for it. They shut down their run. So now having that flexibility is perfect for what our defensive line coach is going to want. To add on that, one, it also allows potential flexibility, especially as we get more and more healthy, for a guy like Levi to work more on the edge and work more defensive end, which he had done this past year until the end of the season when he kicked inside. Now, credit to him, he was good at both spots. He was an impact player. He would make run stops, right? He would make run stops on the inside. That took a huge shot up once he kicked in the inside, but he was good at both. He was good stopping the run and rushing passer from both alignments. But if the Lions want a big, heavy edge setter that's going to be a pocket collapser, well, you need guys on the inside to allow Levi to kick outside. So that helps add that element. Wingo, can he get more looks more on the outside, meaning further outside of a guard, right? Doesn't mean he has to play outside of a tackle, but can he play in a 4I? Can he play in a 4? Well, all of a sudden, you might open up more flexibility there than what you had with Wingo, even though Wingo played 3 tech majority time with LSU outside of a guard, and he did that for the Lions this past year because where we were at health-wise, I always believed when we drafted him that he was going to have to change to playing wider to kind of limit some of this, the fact that he's going to get pushed around because he's a little bit undersized. To limit that, I thought he'd have to kick wider. We couldn't really do that with him last year because of where we were at in terms of the interior defensive line. So you have that. And to me, if you just kind of laid it out, as I mentioned here, you could have a front that says, hey, nose tackles DJ Reader or Roy Lopez. Their defensive tackle that could sit in kind of 3, but can have flexibility up and down the line of scrimmage, could be Lee McNeil, Tyleek Williams. Your defensive end position, which could go from a 4I, a 3 technique, really, from a 4I all the way outside to a 7, right? To a 6 or a 7 technique. That piece could now be Levi Onwuzurike, Mekhi Wingo, or Josh Paschal. To me, doesn't bring as much juice, but he'll stop the run. So now all of a sudden you could have those guys, and then your edge can now be more so, hey, it's Davenport, it's Ahmed. These are your pocket collapsers. And then you have your real just get after it, juice, get around the edge, Aiden Hutchinson, Muhammad, right? These are your guys that can really go get after it on the edge and kind of win around the arc. And then, of course, as Sam backer, you'll have Trevor and Derek Barnes next season. You can throw Grant Stewart in there as well. We'll see if they give him some love there. But the point is, the Lions have a lot of dudes now that make a lot of sense up front. You got 7 guys that I think are going to be a positive impact in both categories. Kind of just use that one example of Washington to kind of expand on it. Washington last year, when we played them in the playoffs, a couple of key notes here. Number one, just to kind of go to the point that I'm making, outside of just the clips that I show of like, yeah, they were gashing us against the run, I also didn't like our coverage scheme early. I didn't think we played enough man. We got to it later, and I think it led to less efficiency for them offensively. The problem is they also created some big plays. So there was some credit to be given there of what they did in the passing game, right? But in terms of just kind of the point that I'm making, Washington had 2.47 seconds to throw in that game. Jaden Daniels did. That was the lowest of the week. The ball was out incredibly fast that week, 2.47 seconds. There's not much you can do there. Even if you win, they only stat guys that are 2.5 seconds or less. So in 2.4 seconds, that ball is out of his hands. You're not going to give him any sacks. And there's true examples, and I pointed to it after the game. It didn't want to be heard. You had wins where the ball was still out of his hands, and that's always the case. It's always been the case. If you can't get a quarterback to hold onto the ball, you're not going to get sacks. It doesn't matter how fast you win. And for a while, was the Lions getting better in the back end to keep the ball in their hands? And in that Washington game, unfortunately, it showed up as, hey, we're not keeping the ball in his hands because the first guy's getting open. So there's that element, which is why I didn't like what the Lions did schematically, because I didn't think they put enough stress on him, made him make enough tight window throws, thought they gave him too many zone windows, easy passes on first down. But you had that element, which we've addressed over the last couple of years, but then you also had the fact that you're not stopping the run. You're not stopping the run. It's not 2nd and 11 consistently. It's not 2nd and 8. It's 2nd and 3. It's 2nd and 4. You're going to get torched on that. And when you have examples like, for example, it's 3rd and medium, or if it's just a situation where you have to really respect the run because you're struggling to stop it, so the safety's constantly coming down the box, now all of a sudden offensively, you can only have really 2 routes go out on the play, and you can chip with your tight ends, and that allows you to create chunk plays because even though your edge rushers still win, they have to work through the chip. It slows down the time. There's not a good defensive plan for that, and as an offense, everything's at your disposal. Play action is now still impactful. Everything's impactful. And for a defense, that's just the worst spot to be in, but that's what we were constantly living in, meaning that they had the lowest time behind the line of scrimmage for their backs in that game, 2.45 seconds. That was the lowest that week. That's the amount of time their backs had to spend behind the line. So they were constantly getting forward against us. And if you look at just individual performances, Zadarius Smith, as good as a rusher as he was last year, and he's a very good rusher, I don't think he's going to come back for price reasons, but obviously I really like him, horrible against the run because he could play the run, but he wasn't an enforcer. He wasn't going to go above and beyond and make plays against run. Jack Campbell will, but he wasn't going to do that. He was going to do his job, and that was pretty much it as a run defender. Chris Smith, okay, he was fine against run, but he's not adding any juice as a rusher. Levi was good against run in the past. He was the one guy that kind of added that element, as well as DJ Reader a little bit as well. So the point in all of this is that the Lions actually, if you just want to look at it from a knee perspective and not just taking BPA, which is in their eyes what they did, and I really like what they did. And, say you get a guy like Isaac Tesla, if he cooks, man, your receiving core is going to be fantastic. And it's perfect because it's also kind of the response to, okay, we had the Josh, we had Chark, and we had Chark and Josh, and then all of a sudden it went to JMO and Josh, and all of a sudden your replacement for Josh could be Isaac Tesla and JMO and St. Brown. That could be the best receiving core we've ever had. That could be the best top 3 we've ever had, and you still have Khalif Raymond, and, we all end up going to get Lovett late in the draft, and love it late in the draft. That could be the best receiving core you've ever had. And they were great last year. But the point is that the Lions, if you're just looking at it from a needs perspective, forget all the talk about edge because they still addressed it. And in their eyes, they went after still an edge collapser, which can still be very beneficial because at edge, they are not super deep in terms of the guys that do that. You have Davenport that does it. You have Hutchinson that does it. But beyond that, how many true edge guys do that? Not many, except for Levi could do that as well. The problem is Levi couldn't play out there because he had to play in the inside because of the injuries that you had. Well, you're going to have injuries coming into this year already, we know of. So if you don't address that spot this offseason, now Levi can't kick outside when somebody's down on the outside. So all of a sudden, Levi's got to go back to the inside. Now you don't have any depth of pocket collapsers. So Ahmed adds depth of pocket collapsers alongside Tyleek adding flexibility for that defensive front. In my opinion, if you're just looking at it from a needs perspective, the Lions did this the right way. They addressed their needs. If you just want to address needs, they did that. Now, would I've liked to get a DPR? Yeah, I would have liked to get a DPR. That late in the draft, at 7th round, there really wasn't a guy there for me. We've already made the case about upgrading over L. It would have been tough to find a guy like that. They could have, though. They really would have just had to pass on Isaac Tesla and go that route instead. And you could have made that case, and that's a fair case. We can talk about that later. But I think Tesla could be really darn good. But the point is, in terms of the top need, we're talking edge and all that stuff. Interior defensive line was the biggest need, and the Lions did address that. So looking back on my old stuff, like you get clouded and all what's going on, the truth is they did what they had to do, and they made the most sense. And now you keep an eye on a guy like DeMarcus Walker. Could they add even more of a pocket or an edge pusher that can add that kind of that John Kaminsky role potentially down the road? But the point is, this was the right move for the Lions. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'm out.